certified arborist, and for those of you that follow on WAMC, I'm the tree man on the radio, answering gardening questions and giving a lot of good information on there on how to do things the right way. And I like to also say debunking myths that are often misconceptions that the public thinks is right. The old one is the volcano mulching that I'm sure we're all pretty much aware of. But you know, a lot of people see that and in the landscape, and then the neighbors think it's right, so they do it, and then other people do it. So a lot of times when you start to teach people the right way to do things, they think it's wrong. And this soil presentation is a combination of soils, mostly soils, a little bit of planting at the end, a little bit of nutrition in here, and it's a sort of accumulation of facts and information that I've gathered from the International Society of Arboriculture, and I would say over the last 5 years at the International Society of Arboriculture's international conferences, the information, we've been always learning a lot, but over the past 5-6 years, the spike has gone up pretty dramatically. There's been, as we learn more and get more technologically advanced, we have more information and we're learning more. We have more data, and the learning curve has just been, the amount of information presented through research has been just in a really heavy-duty spike. And that's good for all of us, because that means we're learning more and more about the right ways to do things. So this is sort of a summary of the last 5 years ISA shows on soils. So this is some of the latest information out there, and I hope you enjoy it. Before we get rolling, a quick plug for the Landis Aboretum. The Landis Aboretum is located in Esperance, New York, and we've been there open to the public since 1951. I've been there for 25 years involved in horticulture and as a director. And we're open to the public, dawn to dusk, 365 days a year. We have native trees, we have a lot of exotics that were planted from all different parts of the world. We're open to the public free, there's no charge, dawn to dusk. We have great collection of labeled plants, great place to see birds. We have, a lot of people know us as the place with the plant sales, because we do plant sales twice a year. It's always the weekend after Mother's Day and the weekend after Labor's Day in the fall. We have a lot of music. We have a full moon music series that happens. So a lot of people come out for a lot of reasons. We have been doing a lot more weddings in general. We have a new conference center that's part of, it also doubles as an emergency shelter should another Hurricane Irene hit our area. But it's a state-of-the-art conference center that we have. We have three bathrooms added, green rooms, conference rooms, Wi-Fi, and the facility is available for rental. And you can find out everything on landisarboretum.org. That's our website. Probably our overall best marketing tool. And the website's also new, so we've been growing like crazy at Landis. And lots of new stuff, new gardens, a new meditation garden went in over the last 2 years. We've been getting a lot of press, and I've been seeing a lot more visitation at the Arboretum. So come visit us. If you're Facebook people, find us on Facebook, and you can see kind of what's going on. We post a lot of daily stuff on what's happening on Facebook. The website contains the more year-round picture. The information I present here again is not Fred's opinion on how we should do things. It's actually facts proven through research through the International Society of Arboriculture. So that's also my disclaimer. Should you disagree with me, you're actually disagreeing with research-based information, not me personally. I try to take my own opinion out of this. Keeps it safe. That being said, all the information, a lot of this information, plus a whole bunch more, can be obtained through the International Society of Arboriculture, ISA's free consumer website. And it's just treesaregood. Actually, it's treesaregood.org. They changed it, but if you type in treesaregood.com, it's going to bring you right to it. It'll redirect. So treesaregood.org. And there's no handouts for any of the presentations, but you will find a lot of this information on this site. Plus, like I said, a bunch more. So Leonardo da Vinci once said, we know more about the movement of celestial bodies than we know about the soil underfoot. And in so many ways, that's probably never been more true, because we're learning more and more and more about what's going on as the soil, in the soil below us. And we're really just starting to touch the tip of the iceberg on this. It's not just the soil and the particles, but it's all the microorganisms that make up that biota or living part of the soil. And that's not just bacteria, it's also our worms, it's all kinds of microbes, including fungi. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a minute. And like I said, the more they're learning, the more we're realizing that we actually are just touching the tip of the iceberg on this. There's a lot to learn. So before we get into the meat of this presentation, we're going to start with just sort of Soil Science 101. It's to start right out with, it's called soil, not dirt. A lot of people call it dirt. Dirt's the stuff you generally suck up with a vacuum on the rug in your house and dispose of in the waste paper basket. Soil is actually made up of mineral particles, a little bit of organics, air, and water. So the average soil composition is basically going to fit in this matrix. And what that is 45% inorganic mineral particles, 50% solids, 50% pore space. Of the solids, 45% is mineral, 5% is organic. Of the pore space, about 25% of that pore space is filled with water, and about 25% is filled with air. This is often where we get into a lot of trouble in landscapes. There's a lot of over mulching. There's a lot of, it's actually sort of another sort of epidemic, I hate to use that word, but it's becoming a real problem because if you think of these mineral particles, that means that's the sand, silt, and clay component of your soil. There's only 3 mineral particles that are going to comprise that soil: sand, silt, clay, predominantly. They break down over eons. Glaciers need to happen. Time goes past, lifetimes are spent, and generations are weathering, and these particles still hold up. They take a long time to break down. Not the same for the organic particles. The organic particles get consumed, they break down rapidly, they get consumed by the living plants, the biota, all the macroorganisms, microorganisms are all chewing this stuff up. So there's a reason to actually have to keep adding organic matter. But when you keep adding organic matter, it ends up starting to change that ratio. And when you start to change that ratio, you head into problems with woody plants. Again, this entire soil presentation is geared towards looking at soils from a horticultural perspective, plants. If we're talking about soils for like engineering and stability for buildings, you're in the wrong course. So this is really geared towards soils, and when we talk about soils, we're talking about horticultural perspective. Looking at those mineral particles, sand, silt, clay, this is generally the look of the ratio of these particles. Of course, this is not the scale, but you can see the sand is gigantic, silt is actually quite small, and the clay is very, very tiny. And sand you can generally look at with your hands, and you can see the individual particles. Silt, you would need a magnifying device to actually see the individual particle of silt. And to see the individual particle of clay, you would need a microscope. So that's sort of the spectrum. And then they fall, the percentages of those sand, silt, and clay particles fall into what you've probably seen this thing from many, many, many times over the years, the textural triangle. So the percentage of, depending on the percentage of the sand, silt, and clay, determines what sort of texture you end up with. And generally speaking, a loam soil is kind of a really good general purpose, all around perfect soil. But all of these could be good, depending on what you're trying to grow. And they change depending on the percentages. Clay has some of the most powerful properties because it can really change soil it dominates the texture. Now, if you're not sure what you have, there's some simple tests you can do. One of them is you can invest in a $350 set of sieves, which will tell you exactly how much percentages you have of sand, silt, and clay, and organic matter. You could also do the jar test, which is basically take your soil sample, put it in a mason jar, roughly half the material in the jar is going to be solid, half's water. You shake the jar super, super good, and then you let it sit there for a day or maybe even a day or two, depending on how long it takes. But usually they say 1 day is enough. And then it'll divide itself into sand, silt, and clay for you. You can see those layers. And then you'll know what percentages you are. And if you know what percentages you are, then you'd actually be able to say, well, I have a clay loam soil. or I have a sandy loam soil. You'd actually be able to say that once you do this test. As you get good and as time goes on and you really see soil a lot, handle soil a lot, and do enough of these tests, you start to be able to look at the soil and feel it and actually be able to come up with a texture. And so that's sort of what I do right there. I can usually look at the soil, feel it, mold it into balls, and generally probably put you in the right part of this triangle just by feeling it. And that comes over time and experience. So it's important to understand the texture because the texture cannot easily be changed. And we really shouldn't even be looking at it from a perspective of, I want to change the texture. We really want to actually look at the texture and know what we have so that we know whether or not we should try to conserve that texture or try to adjust that soil so to be successful with plants. And so that's kind of the main thing. Don't try to change the texture. We're going to try to live with the texture. The next big piece is structure. Your structure is the arrangement of these particles. So you have the sand, silt, and clay, and we have a certain percentage of them that gives us texture. Now the arrangement of these particles creates structure. And structure actually can be changed quite easily for the better or for the worse. So the arrangement of these particles is basically what we're talking about, how they clump together. And if you've ever worked on soils and in the garden, which I'm assuming everybody here has, you've seen like clods, they call them clods of soil, clumps of soil. And generally speaking, the more large clumps you have, the better the soil is for plant growth. The more small clumps you have, the worse it is for plant growth. And soil structure has a huge influence on water and air movement. So water, air in, air out. It also has a huge influence on the biota, the living part of that soil, which is really, really important for plant growth. Has a huge influence on root growth and even seedling emergence. And again, as I said before, from a horticultural perspective, structure can either be good or bad. And it can be improved or degraded depending on how we treat that soil. And generally, like I said before, when the proportion of large to small aggregates increase, soil quality generally increases. So the larger the clumps, the more percentage of larger clumps in that soil, the better that soil is going to be. In weakly aggregated soils, those ones with lots of small little clumps and small little pieces, we tend to get surface crust, so the pores where the water goes in and where the air goes in and out start to fill with little particles. They just get plugged up. And when you get surface crusts or surface filled pores, they generally, when water goes on those soils, it rolls right off the surface. It's hard for it to percolate down. This is a slide sort of showing that. So here on the left, we have large aggregates, large pores, which is what we want. And you can see the water and the air goes down deep into that profile. Here on the right, we have small pores, small aggregates. And the water has a harder time because think of it, the pores and the spaces are tinier, has a harder time getting down deeper into the profile of the soil. And that water tends to accumulate on the surface. Now, when you think about how soils dry out, where do they typically dry out from? Top down. So this is where they would dry out first. So therefore, if your plant's living in that kind of situation, it has water that's over here, less than here, and roots are opportunistic, so they're going to want to grow wherever there's opportunity. They won't grow if there's no water down here. They'll start to come up to the surface, and if you've seen roots on trees where they actually come up to the surface and they start getting hit with lawnmowers, this is exactly why. It's either too much compaction down there, and there's not enough water and not enough air, so they come up to the surface, and that's where they tend to grow, and they can see them. Generally, you shouldn't see a bunch of surface roots. They should be down in the soil profile. So then when the soil gets dry from drought, we've had this year, a really bad drought. In fact, 25 years at Landis Aboretum, this year, this is the driest year I've ever seen at the Arboretum. Coincidentally, last year was the wettest year I've ever seen. And extremes and fluctuations with our weather is the new norm. So we're going to have to get used to that. So in any case, the soil dries up here, And then there's not a lot of roots down here, so what's gonna happen to that plant? It's gonna get stressed out. It's gonna start having major symptoms of environmental stress, drought stress, and other stress. Here, if the soil dries out on the first half of it, it still has all this abundant water down below and air down below, and the roots are growing down below, and you have a deeper root system. So these trees are gonna be a lot healthier and happier during those severe weather droughts and other issues. Plus, they're gonna be an overall healthier plant. You wanna have the roots deeper, not all at the surface. So bear with me on some of this stuff in the beginning of this presentation. It may seem a little heavy or a little bit word heavy text, but it'll get a lot lighter once we roll. So practices that lead to some of this instability or structural problems is tillage methods for one, soil disturbance activities that basically lead to organic matter breakdown, prevent accumulation of soil organic matters, and break up those existing aggregates. So fine tilling, for example, pesticides, fungicides that are harmful to beneficial soil microorganisms, that's going to hurt your soil biota. If you kill the organisms in the soil, you actually start to decline or make that structure worse, because the biota are actually partially responsible for keeping the structure good. You can't have healthy soil if you don't have good microorganisms. Compaction, especially during wet conditions, driving over the tree with heavy equipment, walking around the tree a real lot in like a playground area or a high traffic area during wet conditions more than dry, leads to compaction, compressing those pores. When we talk compaction, we're talking to pores. The half of a healthy soil, half of it is pore space, water and air. So when you compress them, that ratio that we looked at for healthy soils is changing. Now you don't have 50% pore space because they're compressed. And it's easy to compress them. It's really, really hard to uncompress them, uncompact. You can destroy soils in minutes. It'll take years and years and decades sometimes to undo what you've done in minutes. So improving structure, should you have soils that need it? If you have good structure, then it's about conserving and preserving. It's not about having to build it. But most soils are damaged in some capacity. And these types of things can actually help that. So adding compost and mulch, preventing compaction, preventing excessive disturbances all help. Again, depending on what you have, you might not even need to preserve it, improve it. You might just need to preserve it, prevent it from getting worse. Green and cover crops, green manures and cover crops help. These are crops that are planted with the intention of harvesting them and plowing them under. Not fine rototilling them under, but actually turning them under with like a shovel. And crops like this are, a lot of legumes are really good, like nitrogen fixers, beans work well. They put their roots down deep. They fix a lot of nitrogen from the air, they're nitrogen fixers. They store a lot of that nutrition in their root system. And as long as you turn them under before they start to flower and produce beans, where they're going to use that, then you actually incorporate a lot of that back into your soil. Again, not necessarily if your soil is really good, but great way to increase organics into the profile of the soil if it's not so good, but that's bad structure. Increase biological organisms. We'll talk more about that. Decrease tillage. When I say tillage, I'm talking about fine rototilling. We'll talk more about that in a minute too. And as I said before, it can take several years to see improvements, but we can really destroy that in a relatively short amount of time and decline that soil. So, how many people know about mycorrhizae? Okay, about half the crew or so. Mycorrhizae is one of the biggest symbiotic relationships probably in nature. It's a fungus. It's a whole bunch of species of fungus that attach to plant roots and live in symbiosis with plants. So here's your root system of your plant, and all these other threads are all fungal threads. And the mycorrhizae really wants chemicals, byproducts of the plant's photosynthesis and respiration that it secretes into the soil as food. And the more water and nutrients it brings and gathers from surrounding soils, and it brings it to your plant, the happier the plant, the more it will give it what it needs, which is the byproducts. So it's a perfect it's a perfect symbiotic relationship. They expand the root system dramatically. I'll talk a lot about that. So basically, mycorrhizae extract minerals and water from surrounding soil, and they live off of the plant's secretions, often sugars that it has, and they help these plants sort of survive in more stressed out environments. The mycorrhizae is in all healthy soils naturally, so nothing needs to be added, nothing needs to be done. This is not a lab test, this is not a lab experiment, this is not something we created. This is something that already occurs in all of nature, and we're learning more and more and more about how fungi and plants relate. And they're really, the more you learn, the less you know. It's incredible. So they also help to form aggregates. They actually cross mesh and link and hold aggregates. And what we're looking for is stable aggregates. So these clumps, we don't want them to just break real easy. We want them to be a little bit more stable. So when rain comes, it shouldn't just break the clump apart and destroy it. A lot of times with weak aggregates, rain, foot traffic, it just breaks the aggregates down. But these fungi strands help to create stronger aggregates because they actually envelop that with their little fungal hyphae, their roots. We'll look at that under a microscope. So this is a soil particle, and it's all these fungal strands are all mycorrhizal fungus just wrapping around it and helping hold us. Now, of course, you can't see this with your eye too well. This is under a macro or a electron microscope to be able to see this. And this is how it works. The root hair, these are the root hairs. And again, roots are only about, the roots of most of these plants, other than right underneath the trunk where it anchors the plant down, stretch out far and wide. So Physiology 101, they stretch out 2 to 3 times the canopy spread, and they don't go much below 15 inches in depth. So they're really shallow, and they coexist with all the other plants that you have there, including turf grass. So when these little hair-like roots of the plant grow out into the soil, they come in contact with these fungi spores, mycorrhizae, and they're hopefully in the soil. And when it does, it starts to colonize that root hair. You can see it kind of envelops it. And there's endomycorrhizae and ectomycorrhizae. Endomycorrhizae actually penetrate the actual root hair. They'll actually internally penetrate.